Hi everybody, it's Mrs. Allen. I hope everybody's doing well. I hope you enjoyed last week off, and here we are back to work this week. I hope the neurological disorders project went well and you were either able to work by yourself or with a partner. Thought it was a good way to kind of jump back into it and collaborate if you wanted to. And later in the week, we'll have some sharing too, and you'll be able to see other people's projects. So I think that'll be interesting. But I hope you're all staying safe and heeding all the warnings, and everyone's feeling good. So I figured I'd just review some of the notes that were left over from the brain or the CNS chapter. We did cranial nerves on like 1 or 2 slides here in this second set on Blackboard, but I figured I would just address spinal cord today as part of today's plan. So I'm in the Notes Part 2 section from Blackboard, and we're going to start here with the spinal cord slide. And I'll just kind of go through and highlight some important parts. You may just want to listen as I go through and watch which ones I'm picking out and what I'm looking at, and then know that you can, of course, go back later because these are on Blackboard, or you can go back through this notes and you can mute me if you want. So anyway, let's get started. Spinal cord. You know that there are two major functions for conducting impulses when you think about the afferent pathways bringing sensory information to the CNS, efferent pathways then taking the information once it's in the association neurons and then sending it to effector organs or muscles or glands for some type of response. It's also going to be the center for spinal reflexes. So we mentioned a reflex arc briefly. That's where it totally bypasses that, like it doesn't even go to the brain. It goes just from the hit of the knee if your legs are dangling off the side of an examination table at the office, and how you don't even have to process that. It just goes right in to the spinal cord and right back out. So we'll look at that. But the spinal cord extends downward from the brain into the vertebral canal. So think about that large hole in the base of our skull, the foramen magnum, all the way down to the second lumbar vertebrae. The spinal cord is not uniform in length, and there are enlargements in certain sections. And it kind of makes sense if you think about where we would have a mass of nerves accumulating or an enlargement of nerves, and that would be in the areas where we associate where the extremities are located. So our limbs. So we have a cervical enlargement. Remember, cervical is the anatomical term for neck. So it would be in the neck where the nerves that supply the upper limbs enter or exit the cord, depending on if they're afferent neurons or efferent neurons. We have the lumbar or lumbosacral enlargement, so that's a bit further down in the lumbar region, just above the sacrum there, where the nerves that supply the lower limbs enter and exit the cord. Here's a picture of what I was talking about here a second ago. So here's, if you remember the different parts of the vertebral column, or the different bones, the cervical section, T for thoracic, L for lumbar, and S for sacral. Or sacrum. The cervical enlargement here in the neck region, supplying the nerves to and from the arms. Then we have the lumbar enlargement, which is a bit further down. Think about, again, the lumbar region. I always think about, like, if you're driving in the car, that lumbar blow-up thing that makes it easier and feel better. We will get to what comes after that lumbar enlargement here in just a minute. But just note that it goes from the foramen magnum at the base of the skull, as it connects with the C1 and C2 vertebrae, and then all the way down to the L2. I don't know if I missed that on the previous slide. Right here, second lumbar. Okay. All right, so what happens at the end, at the base of the spinal cord? That's where we have this section here, which we'll talk about now. So just below the lumbar, inferior to the lumbar enlargement, the cord tapers to form a cone-like region, hence the cone-like, called the conus medullaris. Okay, it's at the tip of the cord, and it's the second lumbar vertebrae. At the base of that here, as it goes down, that section that kind of comes from the termination of the spinal cord, we have the filum terminale, which is a connective tissue that extends from the top of the conus medullaris to the coccyx area, so that whole area here. The purpose of that is to anchor the cord to the coccyx bone. So the conus medullaris, which is up here just where L2 is, the conus medullaris and the nerves extending inferiorly resemble a horse's tail. So that's why we call that the cauda equina. The spinal cord gives rise to 31 pairs of spinal nerves, connecting the body to the central nervous system. Anybody want to take a guess where they come from? If you think about running down, and I'm jumping ahead a little bit, but if you think about that, the spinal cord running down through the central canal, and then you have, if you recall, all the foramina on the sides, those intervertebral foramina coming from the sides. That's how those different neurons will leave the afferent and efferent neurons. All right, so like the brain, the spinal cord also has gray matter and white matter. So white matter is, I would say, the majority of the spinal cord, and that's the stuff with myelin. So you figure that's where we have all the axons of all the different nerves in that area. And then you have, if you remember, the gray matter. Gray matter is gray because it doesn't have myelin, so those are all the cell bodies of the neurons that are in there. So this is sort of a cross-section, a transverse section of what the spinal cord looks like. So again, just like the brain, and if you think about the cerebral cortex and how we saw that bark-like outer covering, and then of course those patches of nuclei within the brain itself, mostly white with some gray areas. Here, mostly white with a gray area, but it's interesting, the gray area forms the letter H. And there are projections from that letter H. If they face the back, we call them posterior horns. If they face the front, they're a bit smaller. Those are the anterior horns. So remember, posterior is back, anterior is front. There are very small lateral horns, lateral meaning the side, and then we'll talk about roots in just a bit. So what's the gray matter? Gray matter are mostly association neurons. Remember that gray matter is the cell bodies. So if you recall, association neurons are the connectors between the afferent and efferent neurons. So they're sort of the processing neurons here. They're like the central unit, if you will, of the spinal cord. So incoming information comes and then is interpreted by association neurons, and then outgoing information, efferent pathway, goes out. So the posterior horn, these are the back pieces here, the back of the H. Okay, this would be like the spinous processes if there was a bone surrounding it. That's kind of where they are surrounding that. But the posterior horn, where the axons of the sensory information come in, so the green line represents sensory neurons coming in and synapsing with cell bodies of the neurons in the horn. Again, it's gray matter, so they're cell bodies. The anterior horn, cell bodies of motor neurons. Think about that. So this is sensory, this is motor, and it makes sense that you figure if sensory is coming into the posterior horn, then motor or efferent, are going out the anterior horn. So those are cell bodies of the motor neurons. And then the lateral horn exists in levels of the cord associating with the ANS or autonomic nervous system. We'll keep going down here. White matter, remember that white matter comprises major nerve pathways called tracts. When we talk about clusters of axons in the CNS, remember we call them nerve tracts. So the tracts of the spinal cord provide a two-way system between the brain and its parts and outside the nervous system. So just like the name implies, There are ascending and descending nerve tracts. If you recall, actually, you remember when we were talking about the left hemisphere controls the right side of the body and the right hemisphere controls the left side of the body, and it's because there were those pyramids of that medulla oblongata. That's where the descending nerve tracts would then cross. So basically, depending on the direction of movement, here the ascending ones are going up toward the brain, and the pink ones are the descending ones going away from the brain. So the definition is here. So ascending tracts are tracts that conduct from body parts and carry sensory information to the brain. And then the descending tracts that conduct impulses from the brain to parts of the body are called descending tracts. We've already sort of talked about the peripheral nervous system and looked at autonomic and somatic nervous system, so I'm going to skip over that. We mentioned cranial nerves in terms of the first 10. Did we do 10? I think it was. Okay, you can just read over this. 12. We did 12. Does it look familiar? Skip over all of this. Okay, so those are cranial nerves. Now, since we're on the spinal cord, we may as well talk about the spinal nerves. So they're paired just like the cranial nerves. There are 31 pairs that extend from the cord to each side of the body. So here are the sections, like C1 through C8, the cervical vertebrae. T1 through T12 is the thoracic vertebrae. L1 through L5, the lumbar, and then S1 through S5, the sacrum, and then the coccyx below that. All spinal nerves are mixed, and all 31 pairs, except for the first pair, and the nerves in the sacrum exit through, here's what I was saying a bit earlier, those intervertebral foramen. So you have those sort of in between the two different vertebral bones, as opposed to that vertebral canal that runs up through the middle, but the sides. So the first pair between the skull and the atlas, and sacral through the sacral foramina. That's the only exception in terms of passing through that intervertebral foramen. Okay, now here's the root thing that I mentioned earlier too. So each nerve emerges from the cord by two short roots, the dorsal root and the ventral root. There it is down there. So the dorsal root goes to the back, just like dorsal's the back, and once again, sensory fibers. So think about posterior horn, think about dorsal root. That's the afferent pathway. And each dorsal root has an enlargement called a ganglion. Do you remember that word, ganglion? So remember we talked about, I was doing the funny signs like gang signs. Those are cell bodies of sensory neurons. Those are clusters of cell bodies. Okay, so here's that dorsal side, that posterior side. There's the posterior horns. Again, think of this as sensory or afferent, and there's the ganglion. Just you see how you have that projection. You don't see that like accumulation though, that enlargement in the ventral root. So the ventral root is going to be that action, that efferent pathway. So the ventral roots on the front consist of motor fibers, leaving the cord en route to whatever it is, whether it's a muscle or a gland, the effector. And the cell bodies of motor neurons are located in the anterior horn. So keep in mind dorsal and ventral, and then posterior horn, anterior horn. Those refer to the gray matter versus these are like the offshoots that come from there. All right, well, I'm just about out of time with my 15-minute limit on my recording, and I've gotten, I think, as far as we need to. So we began on slide 21 and we ended on slide 31 if you're looking down here in the left-hand corner. So I hope you had a great week. Last week, like I said, I hope you had a good start to the week back to school. And again, hope you're all doing well. And email me anytime if you have questions or concerns, as well as the office hours, depending on the BA schedule. So hope you're all doing well, and I'll be in touch soon. Okay, bye.